Some of you know that last year I appeared on the Daily Stoic podcast, and around that time I got a question from a listener asking my take on Seneca. He was a first century Roman senator who was also Stoic, but his life has sparked endless debate. Seneca's surviving works preach virtue, simplicity, and resilience, and yet at the same time, Seneca, who was also an advisor to the Emperor Nero, amassed a sizable fortune of 300 million sesterces, owned lavish villas, and may have even had a hand in the murder of Nero's mother, Agrippina. On the one hand, his writings are pretty inspiring. His actions, though, leave a little bit to be desired. Today's episode explores this tension between Seneca the philosopher and Seneca the politician. So, was Seneca a true Stoic or a fraud? I'll answer that question on today's episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Questions and Answers, Episode 9, Seneca, a true Stoic or a fraud? As I alluded to in the introduction, today we are looking at a figure who's pretty fascinating and also quite controversial, Lucius Annaeus Seneca. Was he a true Stoic sage or a fraud, or at least a hypocrite? This is a question that people have been asking for 2,000 years, and for good reason. Seneca was an important figure in 1st century AD Rome. He was a philosopher, he wrote plays, and he was also an advisor to the Emperor Nero. His writings survive, at least some of them, like letters to Lucilius and on the shortness of life, and these works give us great insight into Stoic thought. Seneca claims that people ought to live life virtuously, detached from material distractions. They ought to face life's challenges with resilience. He sounds a lot like Marcus Aurelius in many ways, but here is the twist. Although Seneca preached simplicity and detachment, at the same time he amassed a fortune estimated at 300 million sesterces, one of the largest patrimonies in all human history. This wealth included huge villas, a money-lending operation, and there's no doubt that at least some of this wealth came as a result of Seneca's entanglement in the court of the Emperor Nero. And as I mentioned on the introduction, Seneca may have had a hand in Nero's efforts to murder his own mother, Agrippina. So there's a pretty stark contrast between the inspiring words of Seneca and the philosopher's actions. He was called a hypocrite while he was still alive, and even to this day, Seneca is a polarizing figure. A lot of the modern neo-Stoics see Seneca as inspiring and helpful, and they're willing to gloss over some of his personal failings. Other historians are far more cynical, and they largely agree with Seneca's ancient critics. Before I give you my take, I'm going to go ahead and give you a sense of how both sides see Seneca and his main message. So let's start with some of his writings. These writings put forward a strong, inspiring, well-crafted case for Stoic virtue, encapsulated in aspects like wisdom and courage, justice and temperance, that these represent the good that ought to be pursued by all human beings. Wealth and status were not intrinsically bad, they weren't good either, but Seneca said if one is wealthy, that wealth ought to be wielded to accomplish virtuous ends. That would be part of a rational life, a life aligned with nature, where one is not frightened of losing wealth or overly passionate about gaining it, but rather they accept the twists of fortune as it affects their possessions and their livelihood. Seneca probably thinks just as much about time as he does about wealth. In his work on the shortness of life, he said that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. In other words, the way one uses their years is more important than how many they have. Quality is more important than quantity, something that affects many aspects of life. Seneca said something similar in one of his letters to Lucilius. This would be letter 98. He says, quote, "True happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future." This is a plea for Seneca's audience to root themselves in the moment, to shed fear of what might be next, whether it's loss of property or wealth, or even death. He even approaches poverty directly in a few of these letters, such as letter 18, where he says, quote, "We should practice at the stake, and lest luck catch us unaware, we should become familiar with poverty. We will be wealthy with less worry if we already know how unburdensome it is to be poor." That's letter 18. This is a passage that may as well come from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It is Stoicism at its core. A person must train themselves to endure no matter what happens, and if one can do that, fear will not have a hold on them. And despite the fact that Seneca was fabulously wealthy and he never really knew poverty, he did have opportunities to face challenges and to practice what he preached, at least to a certain extent. From 41 to 49 AD, under the Emperor Claudius, Seneca lived in exile on the island of Corsica. It wasn't exactly solitude, but this was Seneca at the peak of his career, and he was forced to live it outside of Rome and the opportunities afforded by living in the capital. And when Nero took over in 54 AD, Seneca became the emperor's advisor, and we have every reason to believe that he made a good effort to instill Stoic values in a young man who was apparently cowardly, temperamental, maybe even a little narcissistic. It's obvious from Nero's life that Seneca didn't succeed in these efforts, but we do see a major difference between Nero when Seneca was alive and Nero after the death of Seneca. We can attribute some of that, no doubt, to Agrippina, but Seneca deserves some credit as well for the first half of Nero's reign being a far more conservative, pragmatic, and thoughtful reign. And I'll just say one more thing about Seneca's writings. They do offer a kind of timeless wisdom. I don't think the modern neo-Stoics are pure opportunists when they talk about Seneca. He writes about timeless human struggles. He writes about grief and ambition and mortality, and much of what he has to say is wise in and of itself. And if we didn't know what we know about Seneca's personal life, we would no doubt have a very high opinion of him. But unfortunately for Seneca's legacy, we do know a little about his life. And what we know raises questions. Could a true Stoic thrive in the morally dubious arena of Nero's court? So let's go ahead and look at the case for Seneca being a fraud. The first point made by many critics, including the ancient critics, has to do with Seneca's staggering wealth. The senator Tacitus and then the later senator Cassius Dio mention Seneca's fortune, numbering the value of his property at 300 million sesterces. A senatorial patrimony at the time was just 1 million sesterces. So Seneca's fortune was astronomically more than even some of Rome's wealthiest inhabitants. He was, in many ways, the 1% of the 1%. And he profited from money lending, which was traditionally viewed, even by Rome's elite, as a sordid form of investment. Now, that's not to say many of these same people that moralized about money lending didn't do that themselves. They did. So in some ways, this is the pot calling the kettle black. But I just mentioned here that Seneca was a moneylender, just like many other elites, and this opened him up to criticisms in his own day. Seneca's wealth was so great that it may have even rivaled the wealth of Nero himself. So for a Stoic extolling the virtues of a simple life, this degree of luxury sticks out like a sore thumb. There are also Seneca's political entanglements. He was Nero's advisor for 8 years from 54 to 62 AD. This was a treacherous, dangerous time in Roman politics, as you might remember from the early episodes of this podcast on the court of Claudius and the court of Nero. There were routine murders, investigations, scandals. Claudius himself apparently was murdered. Nero slid into power through a series of actions taken by his sometimes devious mother, Agrippina. And we don't know whether Agrippina and Seneca got along or whether they hated each other and had a very uneasy alliance once Nero was in power. But we do have the Roman senator Tacitus claiming that Agrippina's murder in 59 AD was suggested by Seneca following Nero's attempt to drown his mother. Supposedly, the speech that Nero gave justifying her assassination was actually written by Seneca. Now, if even half of that is true, it casts a shadow on Seneca's noble words. His potential hand in Agrippina's murder gets his hands dirty with the vicious politics of his age. Tacitus even claims that Seneca's wealth was directly tied to his political connection to Nero. Tacitus reports that Publius Suilius, one of Seneca's rivals, said the following, quote, "By what kind of wisdom or maxims of philosophy has Seneca, within 4 years of royal favor, amassed 300 million sesterces?" That's in Tacitus's Annals, Book 13. Evidently, Suilius said that Seneca was legacy hunting, that he was coercing people to put him in their wills, and also making money exploitatively by making predatory loans in Rome's provinces, where he could get away with bending customs, norms, and maybe even laws. Writing even later, Cassius Dio would call Seneca a seducer and a fraud. So the contrast here is pretty glaring. On the one hand, Seneca preached detachment and discretion. On the other hand, he lived in a palace and practiced dirty politics. We know of other philosophers that lived much simpler and less conflicting lives, and that just makes Seneca stick out all the more. Hence the long-standing debate. But I think there are ways of redeeming aspects of Seneca's character, and I think that his philosophical writings provide some value. We have plenty of writings from Stoics describing wealth as effectively indifferent. It's not inherently good or evil. It's how you use wealth that matters. Yes, Seneca was at times being lofty and overdoing it when he wrote about poverty. But there's no reason to think Seneca could not be wealthy and at the same time detached from his wealth. Seneca said something kind of like this in letter number 5, where he says, quote, "Great is the man who uses earthenware as if it were silver, and no less is the man who uses silver as if it were earthenware, for it is the mark of a weak spirit to be unable to bear wealth." When Seneca extols the virtues of poverty, I think what he often means is a kind of detachment to wealth, an ability to hold wealth, use wealth, to accept changes in wealth, either increases or decreases, without being held captive by wealth. And we have some poets like Juvenal and Martial who lauded Seneca's generosity. They mentioned that he shared his riches virtuously. And I'll even go as far as to say this, and this is not to cast aspersions on every critic of Seneca, but I have to say, making too much of Seneca's wealth, as though wealth intrinsically violates Stoic principles, is itself a kind of performative contradiction. One of the ways in which one can practice detachment from wealth is not merely through generosity or charity or not having wealth or even being impoverished, but it is also important to not envy the wealth of others and rather to be content with what one has. I have read criticisms of Seneca which sound a little bit like envy and even self-righteousness. There's an implication that if thus and such critic or thus and such scholar were in the place of Seneca and had his wealth, they would have done better than him. And that is a pretty dangerous sentiment to have. I don't think that means we can't criticize Seneca's wealth from the position of whether it had a hold on him. But it is a little bit revealing to criticize Seneca on the basis of wealth simply for having it. His politics are a little more troubling. If he truly tried to guide Nero towards reason, that's something, and we should perhaps see his involvement in plots like Agrippina's death as compromises that he had to take because he was a political actor. It seems like Seneca at times wanted to pull out of politics as well. Eventually, the Emperor Nero even ordered him to commit suicide in 65 AD over a charge of conspiracy, and he faced that death as a Stoic with dignity. So, while we know that Seneca was wealthy, we can't necessarily verify that his wealth was obtained through criminality or immorality. And while he does appear to have been involved in politically unsavory actions, he may have had few other options. Seneca was a member of Rome's elite and a political actor. He was not a pure philosopher, and his adherence to Stoicism was clearly tempered by the context in which he lived. He wasn't perfect, and he admits this. In letter number 6, for example, he confesses, quote, "I am not a wise man, and I will not be one in order to feed your spite. So do not require me to be on a level with the best of men, but merely to be better than the worst. I am satisfied if every day I take away something from my vices and correct my faults." It's weird to expect Seneca to be a perfect avatar of Stoicism. Stoicism as a philosophy was, in many respects, a kind of process and progression, and less a state of perfection. I think we see that in the writings of other Stoics that we have. So in other words, we can't place upon Seneca a burden that his own philosophy doesn't even feature. Seneca was, at best, a kind of practical Stoic, and his writings give us a window into a man who had lofty ideals while at the same time living a very real life in a time of decay and degradation. And we have to remember that when we read Seneca's writings. He was a flawed, ambitious human just like the rest of us. And that's probably what I'd like to leave you with. Seneca's contradictions very much mirror our own struggles to live up to our ideals. Philosophy is, for all of us, a journey, not a destination. We learn it. Even our own principles that we all live by had to be learned and figured out, and likely broken by us ourselves on the way to even recognizing them, let alone adopting them. Seneca was clearly brilliant, but one thing I think he was not is a fraud. All right, we'll do one last episode of questions and answers, and then carry on with the narrative of the Pax Romana, so stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.